This session is being recorded.
Great. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Jody Gray, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm the director of the Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services, which we call ODLOS, at the American Library Association. And I'm presenting today with my colleague, Kristin Lahurd, who also uses she, her, hers pronouns, and she is the Assistant Director for Literacy and Continuing Education in ODLOS. Our office supports library and information science workers in creating responsible and all-inclusive spaces that serve and represent the entire community. We do this through using a social justice framework, which means that we do not focus solely on race, awareness, or appreciation, but look at how power and privilege play a part in the institutions and organizations that we move through as professionals and as individuals. Understanding and identifying privilege, implicit bias, and microaggressions, and how they impact people, our colleagues, communities, patrons, is an important part of this work. Today we have three objectives. One, examine the notion of privilege. The second is to examine how privilege and implicit or unconscious bias create barriers for our patrons, staff, and community. And three, to explore how to identify and begin to address microaggressions. All three of these objectives could garner their own workshop or class, and we have 1 hour to spend with you today. So we are going to be just scratching the surface of these objectives. So we hope that by introducing these concepts, we will inspire you to dig deeper. And to start, we'd like to get a sense of where folks are in terms of their familiarity with these concepts. So we have a quick poll that we're going to ask you to participate in through the Zoom platform. And that should hopefully be popping up for you right now. And we'll give you just a few seconds to start responding. Oh, good, people are. Great, it looks like some of you have already had some experience doing privilege, and a lot of you have done some implicit bias work, a little bit of microaggression. So I'm going to share those results. That's where we look, a brief little view. So some of this might be a repetition for some of you, but hopefully, regardless, we'll bring some new aspects to everything we're talking about, and that might help guide the conversation later. All right, so let's begin by looking more closely at the concept of privilege. So privilege is a word that can bring up a lot of complex feelings for most people. And I know that the first time I did a workshop on privilege, I really missed the point. I struggled to remove myself and my own personal experiences from the equation because it's really easy to focus on our own experiences and struggles in life. However, over time, I came to realize that the term privilege was being used and it was about something bigger and systemic, which made me start to realize that language is a tool for social change. So to make social change, people need to understand problems and share a common understanding. So taking my own personal feelings out of the equation allowed me to start to understand and articulate and move towards equity and inclusion. So how do we define and conceptualize privilege? At its base, privilege is benefiting from social group membership. It's the systemic favoring, validating, including of certain social identities over others. These are benefits that are not earned, but rather result from a social advantage relative to another's disadvantage. Individuals cannot opt out of systems of privilege. Rather, these systems are inherent to the society in which we live. So that systemic nature of privilege is key. It's not about who we are as individuals, it's about the systems that oppress some and privilege others. So let's break this down a bit more and look at some examples of privilege through a lens of social justice or social change. So we know that through a lot of research has shown that the average white household has 13 times the financial worth of the average Black household and 11 times the average of a Hispanic household. We know that this doesn't mean that white people don't struggle financially, but it does mean that those struggles aren't because of their race. We all hold some privilege. Earlier in my introduction, I listed my pronouns. I use she, her, hers pronouns, or the pronouns aligned with being female. I was assigned female as my gender at birth, and that is how I identify. Therefore, I hold cisgender privilege. I can't opt out of that privilege, but I can be aware of it and hold myself accountable, which can look like asking myself, how am I taking up space and how am I making space for those with marginalized identities? Let's look at some of the more commonly discussed forms of privilege. There are many types of privilege, and each person may hold a multitude of privileges and still need to reconcile areas where they do not hold privilege. So once again, giving the example of being cisgender, meaning I identify with the gender that I was assigned at birth. I hold cisgender privilege, but I do not hold male privilege. And if we think about who has the most power or influence in the world, we see that cisgender males are the most prominent. We see this through the numerous studies that demonstrate men are paid more than women for similar jobs, and we know that many of the people in positions of power in our country are male. So people hold privilege based on different factors. Things like race, with white privilege being at the top of the hierarchy, sexual orientation with heterosexuality at the top, ability with able-bodied people at the top, and religion. In many parts of the world, Christianity is a religious privilege. We also want to recognize that this is not a comprehensive list, it's just a snapshot of the various types of privilege. And we've designated this last type as, quote, unnamed social identities to recognize that there are always more identities that we need to be considering. So just to reiterate, when we talk about privilege, we're not trying to erase the real struggles that individuals have. Individuals may come from poor economic backgrounds, but they may still hold white privilege or male privilege. It also means it's not only about white privilege and race, because people of color may not have white privilege, but they may have gender privilege or heterosexual privilege. So where do these hierarchies originate? To understand privilege, we have to understand the idea of social construction. Social construction is a concept invented by humans. It's a system of categorization that helps us interpret the world. It can be problematic, in particular when it is based on economic constraints. So in order to justify socioeconomic arrangements that benefit a dominant group, a system was developed that used a hierarchy of human value. This was not based on any true scientific research, but instead to benefit one social group over another. This is played out in different ways all around the world. We know that it's baseless in any scientific manner because as you begin to dig into the concept of privilege, you begin to see the inconsistencies in how these hierarchies of human value have played out, not just in different countries, but even within a single country. In the United States, there were and are laws and policies that can dictate who is white or not. So depending on when and where you were born, you could literally change your race by crossing over a border depending on the infrastructure and the institutions. So this is all a very high-level breakdown of privilege, and we're going to talk about it a little bit and how it looks in practical terms. So we have an internal and individual level. Privilege looks like our feelings, our beliefs, and values, all of which are influenced by what we learn is accepted and familiar in our culture. The messages that I understood were accepted and familiar when I was growing up were things like, there is a binary male, female, gender model. I was taught this because I was taught to interact with women one way and men another. Most clothing stores are broken into a men's and a women's section. Whenever I need to use a public restroom, I knew that there would be at least two options So all of this shaped my internal feelings, beliefs, and values. I learned that anything outside of these accepted and familiar behaviors or identities had a lesser value. All of that plays out inside of me as an individual. It influences my interpersonal actions, behaviors, and the language that I use. So over time, I've challenged and disrupted those learned behaviors, but that requires self-reflection and recognition of the problem. As much as it is necessary to address my own personal privilege, I also need to recognize that these individual attributions and actions are perpetuated by systems. To make bigger, more impactful change, I need to explore systems. So let's look at systems for a moment, which operate through institutions and structures. We see bias and privilege within an institution through its policies and practices. And right now we are seeing more and more libraries exploring their policies, such as going fine-free, as a way to be more accessible and inclusive. We also see libraries grappling with the implications of meeting room policies and practices that may directly go against their stated values of equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is a tricky issue because it also bumps directly up against the stated value of freedom of speech and intellectual freedom. In terms of structures, they operate across institutions and society and rely on the cumulative and compounding effects of societal factors: history, culture, ideology, policies. The biases at that level help shape our biases at the institutional and individual levels. So an example of a structure is media. It helps shape and perpetuate societal norms. So a way to distinguish institutions and structures is to recognize that there are individual institutions within structures. For example, the New York Times is an institution that is part of the structure of media. The libraries are institutions that are part of the systems that need to be examined. And once you understand privilege, then you can start to break it down into various professions or fields, communities, countries, states, etc. Peggy McIntosh has one of the most widely used pieces on identifying privilege titled "Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack." Its a basic conceit is it is a yes or no checklist. Whenever you answer yes to a scenario, it means you have privilege in that area. And if you answer no, you do not have privilege in that area. And we've used this model to examine privilege within libraries. So for example, I can examine the majority of materials in my libraries and see people of my race widely and positively represented. So depending on what lens I'm looking through, I might answer this differently. When talking about race, my racial identity is American Indian. I am Lakota. So I would answer no to that in terms of my Lakota identity. However, if we switch the question and we're asked if my gender, I see the majority of materials in my library, print, or media, see people of my gender widely and positively represented, I would answer yes. Activities like this help us to examine and review where we see a need for change to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion in our profession. And they help us to begin to deconstruct what is at play in creating barriers to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So that is a very quick, high-level overview of privilege, but hopefully it will get you started on your exploration. Now we're going to explore two ideas that are the building blocks of privilege: implicit bias, which is the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner, and microaggressions, which are brief, everyday slights, insults, indignities, and denigrating messages. And for this, I'm going to hand it over to Kristin.
Okay, thanks, Jody. So we define implicit bias as the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. And this definition is adapted from the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at Ohio State University. And that institute is a leading resource for research on implicit bias. The attitudes we're referring to encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments, and they're activated involuntarily due to associations that develop over the course of a lifetime, beginning at a very early age through exposure and indirect messages. So let's examine some of the characteristics of implicit bias. First, it's pervasive. We all have implicit or unconscious bias, including those of us whose job it is to be, quote, impartial, like judges. It is related to, but distinct from, explicit bias. Explicit bias drives our conscious actions based on our strongly held beliefs. We can think of explicit bias in terms of the isms: racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism. But bias is not always problematic or harmful. So for example, I have conscious biases in favor of the humanities and social sciences and biases against math and statistics. And that's because my associations with the latter are negative, built up over years of schooling and struggles. So what's key here is that both conscious and unconscious bias rely on associations. Our implicit biases often contradict our declared values and beliefs. This society teaches us to favor heterosexuality. So even though I don't believe one sexual orientation is better or more correct than another, I might still hold an unconscious bias against those who aren't heterosexual. We generally hold implicit biases that favor our own in-group, but research has shown that we can still hold implicit biases against our in-group. And last, implicit bias is malleable. We learn biases over time, and over time, we can unlearn them. So now we have a short video that helps break down implicit bias. It's from PBS and POV called Implicit Bias, Peanut Butter, Jelly, and Racism.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about why implicit bias matters. It can affect our decisions, such as our hiring decisions, our behaviors, and our interactions. We can look to doctor-patient interactions as one example. A 2014 study used data from what are called implicit association tests and had physicians take them. And these tests can reveal racial preference. The tests were used to examine the impact implicit racial bias had on physician-patient communication. And what the results revealed was that physicians with implicit anti-Black bias, according to these tests, were less likely to report working cooperatively with their Black patient to address the patient's medical concern. And as a consequence, those patients were less likely to follow the treatment recommendations made by the physician. Examples like this are at the individual level, but are part of a larger system of structural inequity. As we mentioned earlier, media are an example of a structure that helps shape and perpetuate bias, and we see it in portrayals and in the news media and across film, television, and social media. An example of how bias is evident in reporting and language is the war on drugs around crack cocaine in the 1980s, which hit African American communities especially hard, versus what's called the current opioid, quote, epidemic, which is hitting white communities hard. Wars have enemies and perpetrators. Epidemics have victims. Finally, implicit bias has broad negative impacts. It's not an exaggeration to say that lives are at stake. We know that bias pervades the legal system, for example, from arrests to trials to sentencing. A computer program used by the US courts for risk assessment in potential criminal behavior was found to be biased against Black people. And in several states, the results of this are given to judges and used by them in determining sentencing. In forecasting who would likely reoffend, the program's algorithm was particularly likely to falsely flag Black defendants as future criminals, wrongly labeling them this way at almost twice the rate as white defendants. For an example that involves libraries, in 2017, the New York Times published findings by a team of economists who determined that local government officials throughout the United States are less responsive to African Americans than they are to whites. The researchers sent roughly 20,000 emails to local government employees, including those in public libraries, in nearly every county. The emails asked commonplace questions like, could you please tell me what your opening hours are? The emails were identical, except that half appeared to come from someone with a name associated with African Americans, and the other half used names that have been shown to be associated with whites. Most emails received a timely and polite response, but emails from those with African American sounding names were 13% more likely to go unanswered than those with white sounding names. And this difference appeared in all regions of the country and was large enough to be statistically significant and unlikely to have been a matter of chance. Implicit bias can play out in our professional spaces in several ways. It can affect our perceptions, how we see people and perceive situations, and our biased perceptions can then play out in our attitudes, how we respond to people and situations. Bias can influence the attention we pay to different people and different identities. So for example, are we paying attention to the needs of everyone in the community? Are our collections representative of a diversity of identities? Are they accessible in different formats? Print, large print, ebooks, audio? Bias can affect listening and specifically the extent to which we actively listen to others. And finally, implicit bias can play out in our language and how we frame what we talk about. Do we use inclusive, person-first language, such as, quote, people experiencing homelessness, rather than homeless people? Do we use gender-neutral language, like saying, do you all have any questions, instead of, do you guys have any questions? Once we recognize that we all have implicit biases, we need to be able to hold ourselves accountable. Just as our implicit biases were learned over time, with intention and time, we can counter them. The ladder of inference is often taught in leadership and management training, and you may have seen this before. We feel it has a great potential to help us unlearn biases and behaviors that are problematic, including but beyond specific professional contexts. And while we don't have time to watch the video, we've listed it here, Rethinking Thinking by Trevor Maber, which explains the ladder of inference. And we recommend watching it, or if you've seen it, rewatching it, and we'll provide a link to it at the end. So let's look now at how implicit bias can manifest in actions. And in this case, we're going to talk about microaggressions. Dr. Daryl Wing Su from Columbia University has been writing about microaggressions for many years. He defines microaggressions as the brief, everyday slights, insults, indignities, and denigrating messages sent to people of color, LGBTQIA+, people with disabilities, immigrants, and so on, by well-intentioned people who are unaware of the hidden messages being communicated. We'll explore examples in greater detail, but this image shows some common racial microaggressions, such as, "Why do you sound so white?" and "What are you?" We also want to recognize the reality of overt and deliberate acts of bigotry. Here we are talking about clear and direct acts of aggression. These play out in physical manifestations, but they also play out in our systems and institutions. A social justice frame of trying to dismantle power and systemic oppression leads us to examine how legislation, laws, and policies reinforce oppression. An example of this is the transgender military ban. The distinction between these acts of aggression and microaggressions may come down to the difference between intent and level of action. The common characteristics of microaggressions are that they are often subtle, unintentional, and ambiguous. This is what makes microaggressions hard to reconcile. Often they're perpetrated by people whose intent is positive, but the impact of the words or actions can be harmful. So let's look at an example. This is a tweet that came from the NPR Education Team Twitter account in 2014. At that time, NPR was being called out for its lack of diversity in its programming, staffing, and resources. A member of the NPR Education Team, a white woman, sent this tweet. It says, "I reach out to diverse sources on deadline. Only the white guys get back to me." In subsequent conversations, she revealed that her intent was to drive conversation in what she saw as a barrier to her work. However, the message that is heard for people of color is that they lack discipline and are not courteous. It did not address the fact that many people of color are, quote, "the only" in their organization, and any major news event suddenly has an enormous amount of requests for feedback. It doesn't talk about the fact that they may be getting back to other journalists who have built a relationship of trust with them. So although her intent was to create a dialogue, it is an example of a microaggression. Let's look at microaggressions in terms of themes and messages that are communicated. Dr. Daryl Wing Su talks about these themes in his book, Microaggressions in Everyday Life: Race, Gender, and Sexual Orientation. One common theme is color blindness. So saying things like, "I don't see color," or "there is only one race, the human race," or "I treat everyone the same." The messages behind those statements might be, your identity is not relevant and your experiences are not real. Imagery is just as powerful and meaningful as words. When we see and even celebrate images that are stereotypical and demeaning, the message is dismissive of people's identities and their histories. So examples are sports mascots that represent American Indian communities, or Halloween costumes that represent ethnicities. Microaggressions occur within the professional landscape as well. Jana Alabi conducted a study of microaggressions in academic libraries and published the results in the Journal of Academic Librarianship. The purpose of her study was to investigate the prevalence of racial microaggressions in the academic library environment and determine whether non-minority librarians are conscious of racial microaggressions their minority colleagues are experiencing. A lobby found that non-minority staff were less likely to experience microaggressions in the workplace and were less likely to observe microaggressions happening in the library. In fact, looking at the results of the survey, you see a large gap in the experience or observation of microaggressions between minority and non-minority professionals. When we think about knowing about microaggressions is helpful in our work in terms of our relationship with patrons, we also need to remember that within the profession and with our colleagues, these issues are also firmly rooted. Our office works quite a bit on recruitment and retention of librarians of color, and we've seen some progress in our efforts to recruit. But we have found that retaining library workers of color isn't as successful. Microaggressions play a part in this, and that's why we need to build awareness of these frames, not only for serving communities, but also for our profession. LIS Microaggressions is a space for those working in libraries, archives, and information fields to share their experiences with microaggressions. We will include the URL among the resources at the end of the webinar. So how can we address microaggressions? For that, I'll turn it over to Jody.
Great. So the research of microaggressions tells us that people on the receiving end of microaggressions feel that they create a hostile and invalidating climate. So Dr. Daryl Wing Su notes, experiencing microaggressions saps people's spiritual and psychic energies, and their cumulative nature can result in depression, frustration, anger, rage, loss of self-esteem, anxiety, etc. So if we know that is the impact of microaggressions over time, then we need to be willing to explore ways to disrupt the status quo. One strategy is to model the behavior you want to address. So I'll give an example of this. When I am in conversation with someone or doing a workshop and someone uses a term that is considered outdated or offensive, I make it a point to try and follow up in my response with more inclusive language. So if someone refers to someone being homeless, for example, I will intentionally use the phrase people experiencing homelessness. This person-first language recognizes that for someone experiencing homelessness, it is a situation and not an identity. My goal here is education. It's not about winning a point or making someone feel bad or wrong. It's about opening a dialogue and helping someone understand something from a different perspective. It can be powerful to use ourselves as a model, so to demonstrate vulnerability and fallibility and to show that this is a process. We weren't born with the knowledge that we now have about equity, diversity, and inclusion. Rather, we can use our own stories and experiences to share how we've unlearned or are in the process of unlearning harmful, inaccurate, and misleading assumptions of information. So let me demonstrate this by sharing a story from my personal experience. I used to supervise student workers, and one of my student workers identifies as transgender. And I met her before she started identifying as a female publicly. I knew her first as a male with a different name for the first year of our relationship. I found myself continually messing up pronouns once she had come out as transgender. I really struggled to shift from male to female pronouns. I would stop myself when I would realize it and correct it, and I had to unlearn that behavior. It was important to me that I get it right, and I worked to change that. But I realized that my intentions did not erase the fact that I caused harm to someone I respected and cared about. So I'm not perfect, but I do try and pay close attention to pronouns in a way that I did not before. And I'm always open to being corrected. I still make mistakes, but I'm definitely more cognizant of the impact and will continue to unlearn this behavior. Another strategy is to focus on the event or situation and not the person. So we're going to share another video here. It's a YouTube video from Jay Smooth called How to Tell Someone They Sound Racist. Jay Smooth is a social justice advocate and hip hop DJ. He created this video back in 2008 and it has over 1 million views. It's a great example of how to reframe a conversation.
Race the final frontier. No matter what channel you watch, no matter what feed you aggregate, it seems like everybody everywhere is talking about race right now. And when everybody everywhere is talking about race, that means sooner or later you're gonna have to tell somebody that they said something that sounded racist. So you need to be ready and have a plan in place for how to approach the inevitable "that sounded racist" conversation. And I'm going to tell you how to do that. The most important thing that you've got to do is remember the difference between the "what they did" conversation and the "what they are" conversation. Those are two totally different conversations, and you need to make sure that you pick the right one. The "what they did" conversation focuses strictly on the person's words and actions and explaining why what they did and what they said was unacceptable. This is also known as the "that thing you said was racist" conversation, and that's the conversation that you want to have. The "what they are" conversation, on the other hand, takes things one step further and uses what they did and what they said to draw conclusions about what kind of person they are. This is also known as the "I think you are a racist" conversation. This is the conversation you don't want to have, because that conversation takes us away from the facts of what they did and the speculation about their motives and intentions, and those are things you can only guess at, you can't ever prove, and that makes it way too easy for them to derail your whole argument. And that is the part that's crucial to understand. When you say, "I think he's a racist," that's not a bad move because you might be wrong. That's a bad move because you might be right. Because if that dude really is racist, you want to make sure you hold him accountable and don't let him off easy. And even though intuitively it feels like the hardest way to hit him is just run up on him and say, "I think your ass is racist," when you handle it that way, you're actually letting him off easy, because you're setting up a conversation that's way too simple for him to derail and duck out of. Just think about how this plays out every time a politician or a celebrity gets caught out there. It always starts out as a "what they did" conversation, but as soon as the celebrity and their defenders get on camera, they start doing judo flips and switching it into a "what they are" conversation. "I have known this person for years, and I know for a fact that they are not a racist, and how dare you claim to know what's inside their soul just because they made one little joke about watermelon tap dancing and going back to Africa." And then you try and explain that we don't need to see inside their soul to know that they shouldn't have said all that about the watermelon, and you try to focus on the facts of the situation, but by then it's too late, because the "what they are" conversation is a rhetorical Bermuda Triangle where everything drowns in a sea of empty posturing until somebody just blames it all on hip-hop and we forget the whole thing ever happened. Don't let this happen to you. When somebody picks my pocket, I'm not going to be chasing him down so I can figure out whether he feels like he's a thief deep down in his heart. I'm going to be chasing him down so I can get my wallet back. I don't care what he is, but I need to hold him accountable for what he did. And that's how we need to approach these conversations about race. Treat them like they took your wallet and focus on the part that matters, holding each person accountable for the impact of their words and actions. I don't care what you are. I care about what you did.
Great. That's one of our favorite videos that we use. And it's a great example of focusing on the event and not the person. So the key takeaways here are: hold people accountable for what they did, not what they are. Recognize the factors we talked about before in our implicit bias, and that implicit bias may go against our stated values. And overall, this is all about intent versus impact. So it can also be powerful to reframe a narrative. So looking at an incident, event, or discussion to reveal a different assumption or conclusion. This is something that's worth practicing. So consider the microaggressions you may have experienced or witnessed. We tend to go back in our minds and think about how we should have responded. It's okay to think through some of that in the moment, but I think there are some common microaggressions that we can think through how to reframe even before that. So for a statement like "I don't see color" or "I treat everyone the same," like Kristin mentioned earlier, you might reframe that conversation as, you know, people have different needs and experiences, and we need to move away from an equality model that treats everyone the same to an equity model that takes into account people's needs and access and privilege. Or it might simply be reframing it as, it's okay to see color, it exists, and it's not all negative. So those are just a few strategies to begin to address microaggressions, and we encourage further exploration. So finally, we've provided this very high-level introduction to these concepts of privilege, implicit bias, and microaggressions. And we know we only have a short period of time with you, and we would like to spend some of the remainder of our time together in dialogue around the ideas that we just discussed. So we have some questions for you to contemplate and respond to, but we also want to hear from you. If you have questions, comments, or stories that you would like to share, please do so in the chat box now. And I'm going to post our first question for people to contemplate. The first one being, how are privilege, implicit bias, and microaggressions relevant to the work of libraries? So once again, if you have a response to this, or if you just have a question or a comment about anything that we presented today or showed you, please take the time to enter it into the chat box. I appreciate that folks are enjoying the videos. That's heartening. Okay, we have a question from Elizabeth, or a comment. In response, it shouldn't, whoa, okay, it's fast. And now we're starting to, so people talking about informing our interactions with patrons and colleagues, as well as programming and policy decisions. Yep. Our missions imply that we serve our whole communities, which are diverse. It's important that we are welcoming, inclusive, and equitable. I think that's key. And I think that idea of like moving from equality to equity is one that we're seeing more and more, and I think is more impactful. Let's see, patrons perceive how they are treated when they visit the library. It directly affects how welcoming we are to our customers and coworkers. By becoming more aware of our own biases and privilege, we can form our responses appropriately. It's relevant in a way we treat our patrons and how we choose materials. This is great. I think it's relevant to the collection development, programming. Let's see, implicit bias can result in assumptions about the type of resource someone is asking for, assuming they don't know how to find online materials and assuming that they're asking for help finding online articles when they ask for a book, but then finding out they do know how to do all of that. They just literally need a physical book. So this happened to somebody yesterday. It was accidental. Yeah, I know, it always, when you make those realizations. So we have diverse groups of people working in our libraries who have diverse beliefs, experiences. They have impact our colleagues. Absolutely. Our second question for folks to contemplate are, what do you think the barriers might be to addressing privilege, implicit bias, and microaggressions in your work? So someone responding to the earlier questions, perhaps up until the 1980s, archivists and librarians may not have deemed it important to collect materials on minorities. Yep. So yeah, what do you think the barriers might be to addressing privilege, implicit bias, and microaggressions in your work? Definitely the library policies, I agree. Getting over the need to be polite and not wanting someone to be uncomfortable. We need to be calling out inappropriate behavior, absolutely. Oh, someone took a critical race theory course and it really opened their eyes. Yeah, not everybody does have those opportunities. That's why we wanted to sort of check in with everyone when we started. This fear of being accusatory. Someone talks about being just socially getting shut out of conversations about football around the Carolina Panthers, but consistently at parties, if the conversation gets shut up, they get shut down. They tried to say something and somebody turned their shoulder and is pointed towards me rather than a normal circle conversation. That's really annoying. I think our implicit biases are a barrier we have to examine ourselves. Yes, I think that's really true. Oftentimes, the people we are presenting such barriers to are those in the majority who may not conceptualize fully the biases. Absolutely. A willingness for self-reflection and change. This is great. Being aware of messages that are put out when you display things highlighting diversity, say LGBTQ books, but they're all focused on queer tragedy. Good intentions, but not having someone in the loop who can critique what is being presented, a fear of negative backlash, tribalism, and also perceived as a Jiminy Cricket or trying to be the social conscious of the group. One person's interpretation of an action or response may be vastly different to another's. Yeah, I mean, I think the key sort of, board members and politicians who don't understand the concept of access. Absolutely, these are definitely the barriers that we need to be addressing, and that's why understanding what these concepts are and being able to articulate them to people. So when you have board members and politicians who don't understand, being able to provide them accessible information like things like the peanut butter jelly video to hopefully get them thinking about things in a non-confrontational manner. All right, let's look at our last question here. What assets or opportunities exist to address privilege, implicit bias, or microaggressions in your work? So we like to always have sort of an asset-based way of looking at things, not just looking at where our barriers are, but for libraries in particular, we think that there's a lot of assets in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and we also need to articulate those. So we like to ask this question too: what assets or opportunities exist to address privilege, implicit bias, or microaggressions in your work? And we're always curious to hear if people have stories about something that a policy that was changed, a conversation that was had, anything in their library communities that we can use as models of doing this work. Someone's working on an online course to start a conversation with the entire staff about these topics. That's great. We love having educational opportunities. Okay. Somebody talks about liking Mindy Kaling, about what she said about her character in her office. It's not that people leave out her Indian ethnicity, but it's the third or fourth thing that come up when describing the character. So whereas frequently race is one of the first descriptions that people use, people have been talking, having another Let's Talk About Race forum for staff. Libraries do provide access, absolutely, to all people. Webinars like this one, policy reviews, employee training, community programming. Someone has training in microaggressions at the library, that's great, and staff development days. I think these are great. We've found, like just like being contacted by you all to do this session, that we're getting more and more requests to go in and do trainings or have conversations about these issues. So, oh yeah, having partnerships with diverse community groups, that's great. Always bringing people into the conversation or taking yourself out into the community is also a big part of this. And staff should, yeah, absolutely, they could be assets to your diverse views. We don't always think of that, and we have a very big aversion to calling out the you know, how race can be an asset, but we use race all the time to make connections. Like, I connect to American Indian communities very easily, and that is a benefit to whatever institution I'm in. I don't get credit for that, but that is a fact. And so, you know, we need to think about those types of things and ways to give people more credit. So this is great. I wonder if anyone has any questions. Like, we appreciate, we have just a few minutes left, and so we want to make sure if there's anything that we went over today that you have any questions about, let us know. This has been really good conversation and hopefully is helping you all think through where you're at in your individual institutions. You know, I love the training thing too. Like, one of the things that I've learned over the years is you can have these trainings which are good, but I like the idea that people are now learning that you need to build in these after training programming to give people a chance to practice how to do this work. It's just like anything else. We need to unlearn things means practicing those things. And so that needs to be built into any sort of training or initiative that you have. So someone asks, are there library forums focused on these topics?
Yeah, we'll share the LIS microaggressions URL, which is specifically an opportunity to share. There's also a listserv we're going to be talking about.
Yes.
Yeah, in fact, why don't we, oh, Caroline posted something. Thank you.
Yep.
And do you want to, why don't we, in the interest of further opportunities, why don't we launch, we have a poll, a second poll to kind of get a sense of what would be helpful.
Right. So what kinds of continuing education would you like to see offered on today's topic? So this hopefully will help the coordinators of today's session figure out what where to focus their energies next. Great. It looks like a lot of more follow-up webinars and reading lists are a big priority.
Okay, we can share the results.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end polling, I think.
Oh wait, somebody's still voting.
All right, yeah, we're going to end the polling and share your results. So at the top, recommended reading lists, and then some follow-up webinars, in-person workshops, online courses, facilitated virtual discussion. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways. Oh, this is good. Someone talked about trying to emphasize February and March, not just as history months. Absolutely, that this work is everybody's everyday work, which is something we say. Oh, that's our tagline. I'm gonna stop sharing the results and close that out. So let's sort of finish up here. What we have here is a list of the resources that we use today. The list Microaggressions Tumblr site is listed here. This will be in the transcript and in the recording. So all the videos that we've used are here, including the Rethinking Thinking, which is the Ladder of Inference by Trevor Maber, that you can watch, which I encourage.
And we can also share the list of resources through this listserv. So if you're not familiar with it, the Diversity Inclusion Lib Inclusion is an open, moderated discussion group to discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion in relation to South Carolina public libraries. The list can be used to share training opportunities, resources and articles, and exchange ideas about how to better serve our diverse communities. So you can register at statelibrary.sc.gov/online-discussion-groups, or you can also email Caroline Smith at jcsmith@statelibrary.sc.gov. And I know that's a lot of information to try to write down, but it'll also appear in the follow-up email that you will receive from the Zoom platform 24 hours from now. And the email will also contain a short evaluation, and we really appreciate whatever feedback we get. So if you could take the time to fill that out, that would be great. It helps us refine our continuing education. And here we are.
Here's our staff. We want to thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. We at the American Library Association's Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services are here as a resource. So we encourage you to contact us with any questions that you have. We love to be part of hearing about stories of success as well. We have opportunities and blogs and things that we can share out people's successes, and even maybe not a success, but something that you're struggling with. Like, we are trying to connect people, much like the South Carolina Library Discussion Group. So with that, I think we're gonna end. We're at 10:57. We'll stay on for the last couple of minutes if there are any questions before it hits 11 here. I'm sorry, we're in Central, we're in Chicago. So, and we will see if there are any final questions, but otherwise we are done. And yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, someone asked, how do you break through the good old boy mentality? You know, I think I'd need more context with that. And I'd be happy to talk to you. So once again, like, if you want to email us or call us, we can talk through, like, if that's something that's on your mind and you want to, like, talk it through with someone, it's helpful for us to have context, because, as you know, we've talked about, all of this stuff is complicated, and so we want to be as intentional about how we respond to things as possible.
All right. Thank you all really for attending and for being so participatory, sharing ideas, suggestions. It's all really helpful.
All right, then we're going to sign off, and you all have a great day.
Thank you.